Using the dynamic keyword versus the var keyword in C# can be confusing. In this video, I'm going to walk you through the similarities and the differences between the two and when to use each. My name is Tim Corey, and if you're new to this channel, welcome. My goal is to make learning C# and related languages as easy as possible. If that appeals to you, go ahead and hit the subscribe button down below. Also, I have a mailing list and a Facebook group down in the description below that you can click on and join. If you join my mailing list, you'll get access to special discounts and insider news. If you're a regular viewer, don't forget to give this video a thumbs up. So let's jump right into Visual Studio. Here I've got a console application started. If you want to follow along, just make sure you create a .NET Framework console application. I've set up a bit of sample code so we can jump right into the demo. I'll start by showing you how to create both a dynamic object and a var object. So let's start with a dynamic object. And we'll call this dynamic, let's call it test dynamic. If I can spell dynamic. And we'll assign it nothing at first. And that works. And now let's say var test var and assign it nothing. Notice the very first thing that happens is we get a red squiggly on the test var. And that's the first real difference between these two. Under the hood, dynamic is really just object. That's all it really is. Whereas a var actually changes at design time to be whatever you've assigned it to be initially. The problem is that means you cannot create a variable without giving it an initial assignment. Even if I came down here later and said test var equals 1, that still won't work. That's because it needs to know right up front what data type it's going to be. Because unlike dynamic, which is under the hood an object, var under the hood is whatever you actually assign it to. So for example, if I were to say var test var equals 2, now test var is actually an int. That means we can only assign int values to test var. Meaning if I change this to 1.1, that's not going to work. And it says 1.1 is a double, but you can't put that into an int. And if we zoom in here, notice it actually says int test var, even though I gave it the keyword of var. So that's the first and most important difference. Dynamic is just essentially an object and can actually change whatever type it is at runtime. Whereas var is a statically typed, meaning it can't change, and it's given that type once at creation. So in this case, when we create it, we put in 2. Therefore, it said, I have to assume I'm an integer because you gave me an integer to start me off. If I had said 2.1, now look, the error goes away because now var is a double. So the initial assignment of a var is very, very important. Now before we go on, I want to talk a little bit more about dynamic. I keep saying that under the hood it's an object, but that doesn't mean it's the same as object. We could say object test object like so. So why would we ever do dynamic? Well, dynamic takes object to the next level. It allows us to kind of hide away a lot of work with boxing and unboxing and all the rest that comes with converting value types. And let me show you what I mean. So let's take this test dynamic and do something similar to what we did with test var. Let's say test dynamic equals 1. So that could be an integer because 1 is an integer. But now let's say test dynamic equals test dynamic plus 2.1. Guess what? That works. In fact, we could say let's output that to a console just so we can see the value of it. And we'll put the console.readline at the end so it pauses. Let's run this and see the value. And the value right here is 3.1. That means it took that initial int and added a double to it. That's an int, that's a double. Now it did that by converting this, and it said, okay, that int can't be an int anymore. It's got to be a double now. It'll convert it and then add the other double to it. So behind the scenes doing some conversion. Now you may say, this is awesome. I can use dynamic for everything because it takes care of all this modification. Slow down. Dynamic is not something we use very often in C#. So I want to get that out of the way right away. So don't, stop the video right now, walk away and say, Tim showed me how awesome dynamic is. All the variables are dynamic now. Don't do that. And here's why. There's a cost to this conversion. And it's a pretty significant cost when it comes to processor cycles. So that conversion isn't something you should do all the time. It's not something you want to do if you can avoid it. That's one thing. Another thing is that we lose all of this design time error checking. There's practically no error checking around dynamic. There's no IntelliSense around dynamic. In fact, pretty much Visual Studio just gives up on dynamic and says, do what you want to do. I don't care. I'll figure it out at runtime. The problem with that is it's very hard not to introduce bugs, and they're all at runtime. And runtime is not the place you want to have bugs, especially ones that don't always show up. So for example, I could say test dynamic dot say hi. Now it yells at me and says use of unassigned local variable test dynamic. So there is a little bit of checking, but check this out. Let's go back up here, and I'm going to say equals empty string. Look at that. My error went away. The only thing it checked for is, did you start off with a value? So since I started off with a value, it says you might have a method in there called say hi. We don't, but you might. If we run this, I get an unhandled exception. String does not contain a definition for say hi. But notice that's at runtime, not at design time. If I were to say on this test var dot set, notice IntelliSense first of all, say hi, it goes, no. You don't have a say hi on this double. Because again, it's strongly typed. It's essentially the same thing right now as this is. Let's have a little more fun and actually wipe out most of this stuff right here and start over. And instead of assigning them initial values of empty string and a double, let's assign them a new person. Now I created the person class over here. It has two properties, first and last name, and a public void say hello that writes the console, hello and your name. That's all there is to it. So I said test dynamic equals new person. Great. I'm going to do the same thing over here for my, and it's not a double anymore, it should be a var. They both seem to work. So now let's say test dynamic dot, notice no IntelliSense, first name equals Tim. It doesn't yell at me because it won't. Test dynamic dot last name equals Corey. Now the problem here, the first problem that I see is with no IntelliSense, what if I did this? Now C# is case sensitive, that's not valid. Does it yell at me? No. So if I don't notice that I mistype something, I've got a runtime error. That's a problem for me. Test var dot first name, again IntelliSense, equals Sue. Test var dot last name equals Storm. Now I can say console write line. Let's do test dynamic first. And the method name, again, this is tough. Come back over here, it says say hello. So say hello. And we'll do the same exact thing, only we'll do it with test var. Now again, it's in the IntelliSense list. And it's saying here, because I originally assumed say hello returns a string. But notice it returns a void. It didn't yell at me here, but here it says, no, you can't do that in a console write line. Well, it's got a console write line inside of it, so we just need to call the actual method. There we go. So now we're calling that method. Let's run this. I'll pull it over here. Hello, Tim Corey. Hello, Sue Storm. So they both work. The difference is this one's harder to use, but it works, versus this one is really easy to use. It'd be the same as having person test var equals new person. Now, let's get a little squirrely here and say test dynamic equals hi. Then let's say test var, just to show off, equals hi. And it says, no, you can't do that because you can't assign a string to a console UI.person. So we can't do that. But we can with test dynamic, or at least doesn't yell at us. Let's see if it actually worked. So I'll say console write line test dynamic, because that should be a string now. I'll run this, and we'll see hello Tim Corey, hello Sue Storm, and hi. So I changed the type of test dynamic on the fly at runtime, and it was okay with it. So it wiped out that instance of person and put instead a string. Now, can you imagine the problems you could cause with this type of solution? Imagine you have a method that has, say, 100 lines of code in it. Probably not the best method. You should probably have shorter, smaller methods that do one thing and do it well. But say you do, and you decide, I'm going to create a variable at the top that's going to say, maybe the variable's name is first name. And you put first name equals Tim. And then later, you say, well, I've got this first name object that I want to use, and so I'll create a new instance of it and put it into a variable named first name. Well, and that's a contrived example, but say you do. You've just stepped on the toes of your variables, and you don't even know it. You don't know that you're overriding that variable with a different type. You can't tell what that type is, and so you can cause a whole bunch of weird reactions in your application because you can change the type at will. Imagine if you had an addition formula and you had a value of x, but then you put a string into x. Well, if you take a string in x and then add 2 to it, it's going to append the number 2 to the string, not add 2 to your number. So weird reactions can happen very easily. And one last thing, just to reiterate, I can do this. Testdynamic.email equals test@test.com. And dynamic says, sure, why not? Until I hit the start button, and then it says no. Because there is no property called email in a person object. So again, dynamic versus var. var is strongly typed and it is statically typed, meaning you can't change it like we can dynamic. Dynamic is changeable, it's flexible. It'll switch from a person instance to a string, no problem. Whereas this test var has now been locked into being a person instance. It can't be anything else for the lifetime of this variable. Now let's talk about one more type or way to use dynamic. So let's clear all this out. We really don't need it. And in fact, we don't even need these here. So I'll just start them off as strings for both of them, just so we have something there. But we don't really care about these right now. So this is a method. It returns a string. The string is, this is a test. So we can say console writeline get message, and that will return this is a test on the console. All right? So that's pretty straightforward. Nothing to do with dynamic or var. What we cannot do is this. We can't return a var type. That won't work. But we can return a dynamic type. And if we do that, this is a test. So it comes back as a dynamic object, which in this case is just a string. So if you're creating a method, the return type cannot be var, because we have to know the return type specifically, and it can't infer it based upon the signature line. And so it says, since I can't infer it, then you can't use it. So you can't return a var, but you can return a dynamic, because at the root of it, dynamic is just an object with some extra stuff attached to it. So go ahead and do it, not a problem. Now, you shouldn't for most instances. I'm not saying do this. I'm just saying this is possible. Now, let's talk about why. Why and when. So let's start with dynamic. When is dynamic needed? Well, Microsoft in C# has built a strongly typed system, meaning everything has a definitive type. Like a string is a string, it can't change. Other languages, say JavaScript. JavaScript only has one variable type. It's called var. And anything can change on a var. Meaning a var can start off as a string, it can change to an int, it can change to a double, it can change to an object. And so it acts a lot like the dynamic keyword. C# is not that way. It's not designed to operate with dynamic variables. It's designed to operate primarily with strongly typed variables, strings, ints, class instances, and those shouldn't change over their lifetime. They should always stay the same. But Microsoft did see a need for a dynamic keyword when we're talking to other languages or other systems. For example, if you try and bring in a Python application or a Python API or Ruby or a COM object, it makes it much, much easier to work with those if you have the ability to have a dynamic object. And so that's what the dynamic keyword is for. So if you're using things outside of C# and talking to them, dynamic might be useful in that case, and it might be the best solution. However, if you're dealing with just C# code, dynamic is almost universally not the right option. Conversely, var. Some people swear by using var for everything. So if you're going to declare a variable, it gets declared as var. And that's actually a preference that can be set inside of IntelliSense. So it says, if you say string first name, it goes, how about you use var instead? And there's actually people who will argue all day over whether to say var or string for a type. I'm not that uptight. Here's the argument for one side and then the other. The argument for the var only side is that your code should be self-documenting, and you shouldn't rely on seeing that it says string in order to know that this is a string. So it should be obvious what the type is by your variable names. So if you have a variable name that's not obvious, having var in front of it kind of forces you to say, wait, I should call this age number, or age in whole numbers, or some kind of descriptive variable name. And those aren't great, but descriptive variable name to say what this is. Not doing the Hungarian case of int age. That's not what I'm talking about, but just good naming. And so it says, you know what? If you really need to know what that type is, just mouse over it. It'll tell you. And so they var everything. The other side says, you know what? It's clearer to say what the actual type is. And so if you have the opportunity, say string. Why make things more difficult by not giving the actual type and making the reader actually mouse over something to figure out what it is? So that's the general argument. There's much more to be said on both sides. Here's where I land. I typically, in my programming, will use the actual types for the normal ones. Okay, string, int, double, decimal, and all the rest. One of the reasons is because double versus decimal, that's a tricky one. Because if I say, let's go with test var again, equals 1.1. Cool. What type is that? Well, it's in double. What if I intended it to be currency, which should be type decimal? Well, I should have added at the end of it a capital M, and now it's a type decimal. That's easy to forget. But if I were to say double my money equals 1.1, that's going to work. But if I said decimal my money, it goes, no. That's a double. This is the decimal. So having a specific type, especially in this one case, really helps me, because if I've said I want this to be a decimal, then it's going to force me to make sure I use that capital M at the end to indicate that static number is in fact a decimal. So that's one little edge case. The other thing is I like my code to be readable. Now I try very hard to make good names out of my variables, but I don't think it hurts anything to also have in front of it string. So if I have int age, you know it's an integer, a whole number for the age. Where if I have double age, you know I could mean 1.2 years old. So those kind of things I like to specify and just make sure it's clear. However, there are times when I use var. One of them is when something is long. Okay, I came across this the other day when I was creating a video where I had a list of a list. So a list of a list of, let's just say string, or let's say person. That's kind of long to type out. It's also as long when you say for each, and you have list of person item in P. Well, here I could cut out that typing by saying var. Here I could cut out that typing by saying var. Now, since I have this right away in the assignment, it's pretty clear, it's very clear what this variable is. And here, if I had named things right, then it'd be clear as well. Now, in my case, I had the variable name was rounds. This is the tournament tracker, so it had a number of rounds. So I had var round in rounds. That's pretty clear. This is multiple rounds. This is one round. So that's one time that I use var, when it's long. Another time I use var is when I don't know the type. And you might think, well, why wouldn't you know the type? Well, let's look at this. Var my item equals new anonymous method. And I can say first name equals Tim and email equals test@test.com. This is an anonymous object. It doesn't have a name. I just created it on the fly. So how can I then say what type it is? It doesn't have a type. It's anonymous. Therefore, I have to use var. Now, just so you know, I'll just demonstrate this real quick. If I were to say console write line, and let's just do our $, double quotes, and say hello, I can say my item dot, check this out, IntelliSense, an anonymous object. Hello, first name, your email is my item dot email, like so. If we were to run this, it does in fact run, and it says, hello, Tim, your email is test@test.com. So that works, and the only way to do this is to use the var keyword. Similarly, if I'm using a link query where I'm returning a subset where I'm saying select these items, I'm creating a list of anonymous objects, in which case, again, I use the var keyword. So that's how I use it. I mix and match. When I have the simple types, or like even my class instances, I typically type it out. But if it's long, or if I don't know the type, or if I come across something where it just makes sense to use var, in my opinion, so that can be, subjective, but I don't feel a problem using var. There's no problem because it is strongly typed. But in the normal cases, I use the actual type. So that's my differentiation of when to use var versus when to use the actual type name. But as far as dynamic goes, I almost never use dynamic. It's a really powerful object, but it's expensive and it's not designed for typical C# application. It's also a lot harder to use inside of Visual Studio because of lack of IntelliSense and a lack of design time error checking. So that's the difference between var and dynamic. I hope you got a lot out of this, but I'd love to know what you think. So leave a comment down below. Let me know what you think of this and if you understood it. Also, I'd love to know what your personal opinion is on using var versus the actual type. All right, thanks for watching, and as always, I am Tim Corey.